You know, I've been to more military funerals than I care to count over the past 50 years, but I've never seen anything like what happened at Arlington National Cemetery on October 15th, 2023. Name's Thomas Tank Williams, United States Marine Corps, served 2 tours in Vietnam from 69 to 71, and I was there that day to pay my respects to General Marcus Connors, a man whose name every Marine knew, whose legend had grown larger than life over 5 decades of service. What I witnessed that afternoon didn't just change my understanding of honor and sacrifice. It changed everything I thought I knew about the bonds that tie warriors together across generations, wars, and the bureaucratic machinery that sometimes forgets the very people it's supposed to serve. This story's gonna make you madder than a hornet's nest, then prouder than the day you first put on the uniform, then probably leave you crying like a baby. But stick with me, because what happened when they tried to turn away one forgotten old soldier will restore your faith in what America is supposed to stand for. It was one of those crisp October mornings in Virginia when the leaves are just starting to turn and the air has that clean, sharp quality that makes you remember why you love this country. I'd driven down from Baltimore the night before, staying in a cheap motel because my pension doesn't stretch to fancy hotels, but I wouldn't have missed this funeral for anything in the world. General Marcus Robert Connors, 4-star general, hero of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, had died at age 78 after a 6-month battle with lung cancer, probably from Agent Orange exposure, though the VA would never officially admit that. The ceremony at Arlington was everything you'd expect for a man of his stature: full military honors, honor guard from all 5 services, foreign dignitaries, cabinet members, senators, the works. Security was tighter than Fort Knox on payday. I'd gotten to the cemetery around 9 a.m. for an 11:30 service, partly out of respect and partly because at 74, I don't move as fast as I used to, and I needed time to navigate the crowds, security checkpoints, and find a decent spot where these old eyes could see what was happening. My knees aren't what they used to be either. Too many years humping a pack through Vietnamese jungles and too many decades in construction work after I got out. That's when I first saw him. He was standing at the outer security perimeter, maybe 200 yards from the main gate, holding what looked like a single white flower wrapped in tissue paper. Had to be in his mid-70s, wearing an old dress uniform that immediately caught my attention. The kind of faded olive green that told you it was vintage Vietnam era, probably hadn't seen daylight in decades. But here's what struck me. That uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, boots shined to mirror finish, hat positioned at exact regulation angle. You could tell this wasn't some costume or replica. This was the real deal, cared for with the kind of devotion that comes from deep respect for what it represents. What really got my attention, though, was how he carried himself. The man was standing at perfect parade rest, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders square, eyes forward. Military bearing so deeply ingrained it was automatic, even after probably 50 years out of uniform. This wasn't some weekend warrior or wannabe. This was a career soldier, no question about it. The uniform had no visible ribbons, no medals, no rank insignia that I could see from my position. Just the basic dress uniform and that weathered face of a man who'd seen things he couldn't forget and carried burdens he couldn't share. His hair was snow white, neatly trimmed in a military cut, and his hands, what I could see of them, were the calloused, scarred hands of someone who'd worked hard his entire life. What struck me most was his absolute stillness. In a world where everyone's constantly moving, checking phones, fidgeting, this old soldier stood like a statue, like he was on guard duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier, like he was protecting something sacred just by being there. I was about to walk over and introduce myself, one vet to another, when I saw the confrontation begin. A young Army sergeant in dress blues, couldn't have been more than 25, approached the old man with the confident stride of someone who'd been given clear orders and intended to follow them to the letter. "Sir, this is a restricted area," the sergeant said, his voice carrying that particular authority young soldiers learn to project. "Do you have authorization to be here?" The old man looked up with eyes that were sharp and clear despite his age, the kind of pale blue that seemed to see right through you. "I came to pay my respects to General Connors. Sir, I'm going to need to see your invitation and military ID. This is a private ceremony for family and authorized personnel only." Without hesitation, the old man reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, the way you do when you're dealing with security, and pulled out what looked like a standard military ID card and a folded piece of paper. The sergeant examined both documents, his frown deepening with each second. "Staff Sergeant," the young soldier squinted at the ID, "Franklin J. Hayes, retired. Sir, I don't see your name on the authorized personnel list." "I'm not on any list," Franklin Hayes said quietly. "I just wanted to be here when they laid him to rest." The sergeant called over his supervisor, a staff sergeant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than dealing with this situation. Staff sergeants are the backbone of the military. They're the ones who handle the real work while officers make speeches. And this one had the tired look of a man who'd been dealing with diplomatic protocol and VIP security all week. "What's the situation here?" the staff sergeant asked. "Sir, this gentleman doesn't appear to be on the authorized list. His ID shows him as Franklin J. Hayes, staff sergeant, retired. He says he wants to attend General Connors' funeral." The staff sergeant's expression softened slightly when he heard staff sergeant. There's an automatic respect that NCOs have for each other. But he shook his head regretfully. "I'm sorry, sir. Without proper authorization, I can't admit you to the ceremony. Security protocols are very strict for events like this." "Are you family?" the younger sergeant asked. Franklin Hayes shook his head. "No, I served with him. A long time ago." The staff sergeant studied the old man's face, probably seeing the same things I was seeing. The bearing, the genuine respect, the quiet dignity. "I appreciate your service, sir, and I understand wanting to pay your respects, but my hands are tied here. There's a public viewing area about a quarter-mile down Jefferson Davis Highway where you can watch the procession." "That's not necessary," Hayes interrupted gently. "I understand the rules. I'll just stay here for a few minutes." "Sir, you can't remain in this area. You'll need to move back beyond the outer perimeter." Franklin Hayes nodded once, sharply, the way soldiers do when they've received an order they don't like but will follow anyway. "Roger that," and that's exactly what he did. Without argument, without complaint, without the kind of scene that might have drawn unwanted attention, Franklin Hayes stepped back about 50 feet to a spot just beyond the outer security line and resumed that same parade rest position, holding his single white flower. For the next hour and 15 minutes, I watched this old soldier stand motionless in the Virginia sun while inside the cemetery, hundreds of dignitaries, generals, politicians, and family members gathered to honor General Connors. Hayes never moved, except to occasionally shift his weight from one foot to the other. Never complained, never tried to argue his way in, never made a spectacle of himself. He just stood there, a silent sentinel paying his own private tribute to a fallen comrade. It was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. As I made my way through security and found a seat toward the back of the ceremony area, I found myself thinking about this unknown veteran more than the impressive gathering taking place around me. Who was he? How did he know General Connors? What was the story behind that lonely vigil outside the gates? And why wasn't he on any guest list for a man he'd clearly served with? The ceremony itself was everything you'd expect for a 4-star general. The Secretary of Defense gave a stirring eulogy about General Connor's 40-year career, his leadership in 3 different wars, his innovations in special operations tactics. Foreign military attachés paid tribute to his role in international coalition building. Fellow generals spoke about his mentorship of younger officers and his dedication to the welfare of enlisted personnel. But through it all, I kept glancing back toward the security perimeter, where Franklin Hayes continued his solitary vigil. The man hadn't moved in over an hour, hadn't sat down, hadn't sought shade, hadn't even shifted his position. Just stood there like a guard on duty, protecting something sacred with his presence. That's when I noticed the disturbance. About 30 minutes into the ceremony, during the eulogy being given by General Patricia Morrison, one of Connor's former subordinates, I saw a colonel lean over and whisper something urgent to a 3-star general sitting in the 3rd row. The general, I later learned his name was Andrew Price, immediately turned to look toward the security gates. General Price stopped listening to the eulogy and began scanning the area outside the perimeter with the focused intensity of a man who'd just received intelligence that changed everything. When his eyes found Franklin Hayes, still standing at attention with his flower, the general's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like shock. Without a word, General Price leaned over to another officer, whispered something that made that man's eyes widen, then quietly stood up and began walking toward the back of the ceremony. He wasn't running or causing a scene, but he was moving with the kind of purpose that suggested something critically important was happening. I was sitting near the back, so I had a clear view as General Price walked all the way to the security checkpoint and spoke briefly with the guards. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw him point toward Franklin Hayes, saw the sudden change in the guards' posture, saw them look at each other with expressions that suggested they'd just received orders that conflicted with everything they'd been told before. What happened next stopped the entire ceremony. General Price walked through the security checkpoint and approached Franklin Hayes. The old veteran looked up, clearly surprised to see a 3-star general in full-dress uniform walking directly toward him. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and I could see recognition dawning on both their faces. And then General Andrew Price did something that sent a shockwave through the entire gathering. He came to attention and rendered a full, formal military salute. Not a casual acknowledgement, not a polite gesture, but the kind of crisp, respectful salute you give to a superior officer or a Medal of Honor recipient. Franklin Hayes, after a moment of obvious confusion, straightened to his full attention and returned the salute with the precision of a man who'd done it thousands of times. The 2 men held that salute for what felt like an eternity, and in that moment, 50 years of military protocol and bureaucratic barriers seemed to evaporate. Here were 2 warriors, separated by rank and time, but united by something deeper than ceremony. When they dropped their salutes, General Price extended his hand. They shook, not the quick, perfunctory handshake of formal occasions, but the firm, meaningful grip of men who'd shared something that couldn't be expressed in words. They spoke quietly for a moment, and I could see tears beginning to form in both their eyes. Then General Price gestured for Franklin Hayes to follow him back toward the ceremony. The murmur that went through the crowd was audible even from where I was sitting. Hundreds of heads turned to watch this unprecedented moment. Who was this man? Why had a 3-star general stopped a state funeral to personally escort him in? What was the story behind this extraordinary breach of protocol? But that was just the beginning of something that would change everything I thought I knew about courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that tie warriors together. As Franklin Hayes walked through the security checkpoint alongside General Price, something unprecedented began to happen. The honor guard, without any visible signal or command, came to attention. Then the color guard snapped to attention. Then, one by one, every service member in dress uniform began standing and saluting as this unknown old soldier walked past. It started with the Marines nearest the entrance, their dress blues gleaming in the afternoon sun. Then the Army personnel, then the Navy and Air Force contingents. Like a wave spreading through the crowd, every man and woman in uniform rose to their feet and rendered honors to Franklin Hayes. The Secretary of Defense stopped his eulogy mid-sentence, looking confused at the disturbance. General Connors's widow turned in her chair, trying to understand what was happening. Foreign dignitaries whispered urgently to their interpreters. Members of Congress looked around with the bewildered expressions of people who'd lost control of a carefully scripted event. And Franklin Hayes, clutching his single white flower with hands that were now visibly shaking, walked through it all with the same quiet dignity he'd shown, standing outside the gates. His back was straight, his pace measured, his eyes forward, every inch the professional soldier even in this moment of unexpected honor. General Price led him directly to the front row, where he gestured for others to make room. Franklin sat down just 3 seats from General Connors's widow, still holding his flower, still maintaining that perfect military bearing despite the unprecedented attention being paid to him. But the ceremony didn't resume immediately. Instead, General Price walked to the podium and asked the Secretary of Defense if he could add something to the eulogy. The secretary, clearly flustered by the break in protocol, nodded and stepped aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Price began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent cemetery, "I need to share something with you about the man we're honoring today and about the veteran who just joined us." The crowd was dead silent. You could hear the wind in the trees, the distant traffic on Jefferson Davis Highway, the creak of leather as hundreds of people leaned forward to listen. 54 years ago, General Price continued, in a jungle outside Da Nang, South Vietnam, a young second lieutenant named Marcus Connors was leading his first combat patrol when his unit walked into a carefully planned ambush. Franklin Hayes was staring at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to escape it. The lieutenant was wounded in the initial contact, along with 2 of his Marines. They were pinned down by heavy machine gun fire, taking casualties with no way to reach safety. The situation was desperate, and it was about to become hopeless. General Price paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. That's when a staff sergeant from another unit heard the firefight and made a decision that would change the course of history. Without orders, without backup, without regard for his own safety, that staff sergeant left his position and moved through enemy fire to reach the trapped Marines. The general's voice was getting stronger, more emotional. That Staff Sergeant Franklin J. Hayes, single-handedly extracted 3 wounded Marines from that killing zone. He carried Lieutenant Connors on his back for over 200 meters through jungle and enemy fire. He went back for the other 2 Marines, one at a time, exposing himself to enemy fire again and again until all 3 men were safe. You could hear people in the crowd beginning to murmur, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "Staff Sergeant Hayes saved 3 lives that day," General Price said, his voice now thick with emotion. "But he saved more than that. He saved the life of a young officer who would go on to serve for 40 years, who would lead thousands of Marines in 3 different wars, who would innovate special operations tactics that are still used today." Franklin Hayes was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face as memories 54 years old came flooding back. Every life that Marcus Connors saved in his 4 decades of service, every young Marine he mentored, every successful mission he led, every strategic innovation he developed. All of it was possible because one staff sergeant made the decision to risk everything for 3 Marines he barely knew. The general paused, looking directly at Franklin Hayes. Franklin Hayes didn't just save 1 Marine that day in Vietnam. He saved every life that Marcus Connors went on to protect throughout his career. He changed the course of military history without ever getting credit for it. The crowd erupted in applause, but Franklin Hayes never moved. He just sat there, overwhelmed by the recognition he'd never sought and never expected, still holding that white flower like it was the most precious thing in the world. But General Price wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "There's something else you should know about Staff Sergeant Hayes," he continued, and his voice took on a harder edge. "After he saved Marcus Connors and 2 other Marines that day, he was put in for the Silver Star. The recommendation was written by his platoon sergeant, witnesses were interviewed, all the paperwork was properly filed." The general's jaw tightened, and I could see anger building in his expression. Staff Sergeant Hayes never received that medal, not because he didn't deserve it, but because 3 weeks after the rescue, while he was on another patrol trying to save another group of Marines, Franklin Hayes was wounded by a mortar round, severely wounded. He spent 8 months in military hospitals, first in Da Nang, then Japan, then Walter Reed. The crowd was dead silent now, hanging on every word. During those 8 months, his Silver Star paperwork was lost in the administrative chaos of a war zone. When he finally recovered enough to return to duty, he was assigned to a different unit. The men who could vouch for his heroism had either rotated home, been transferred, or been killed in action. General Price's voice was getting angry now, the controlled fury of a professional soldier who'd seen good men betrayed by bureaucracy. Without witnesses, without documentation, without anyone to speak for him, Franklin Hayes's heroism was forgotten by the system he'd served with such distinction. The Silver Star recommendation was filed and forgotten. The man who'd saved 3 Marines and changed the course of military history became just another name in a personnel file. The silence in that cemetery was profound. You could feel the weight of injustice, the collective understanding that something terrible had been allowed to happen. "But Marcus Connors never forgot," General Price said, his voice softening. "For 54 years, Marcus Connors looked for Franklin Hayes. He hired private investigators, contacted veteran organizations, searched military records, spent his own money trying to find the man who'd saved his life." Franklin Hayes looked up at the casket, tears flowing freely now. Marcus Connors wanted to do 2 things before he died. First, he wanted to thank Franklin Hayes personally for giving him the life that made everything else possible. Second, he wanted to make sure that Franklin Hayes received the recognition he'd earned 54 years ago. General Price signaled to an aide who stepped forward carrying an ornate wooden presentation box. "Marcus Connors never found Franklin Hayes in life," the general said, "but he made sure that his final wishes would honor the debt he could never repay." In his will, General Connors left specific instructions that if Franklin Hayes ever appeared anywhere, at any ceremony related to his death, he was to receive this. The aide opened the box, revealing a Silver Star medal gleaming in the afternoon sun. By order of the Secretary of the Army, with the posthumous recommendation of General Marcus R. Connors, and pursuant to witness statements taken before General Connors' death, it is my honor to present the Silver Star for gallantry in action to Staff Sergeant Franklin J. Hayes, United States Marine Corps. As General Price pinned the medal on Franklin's faded uniform, the entire assembly rose to their feet in sustained, thunderous applause. But Franklin Hayes just looked down at the medal, then up at the casket holding the man who'd spent 5 decades trying to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. "I didn't do it for a medal," he said quietly, his voice barely audible even with the microphone. "I did it because he was my Marine." Those 6 words, "he was my Marine," said everything about duty, loyalty, and the bonds that tie warriors together across time and circumstance. But even that wasn't the end of this extraordinary day. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, I noticed something that made my old Marine heart swell with pride. Veterans throughout the gathering, men and women from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, were making their way over to Franklin Hayes, not to gawk or take selfies, but to pay their respects to a warrior who'd been forgotten by history, but remembered by the people who mattered most. I watched an old Navy chief petty officer, probably 80 years old, walk up to Franklin and simply say, "Thank you for your service, Marine." Watched a young Army captain, fresh from Afghanistan, salute Franklin and tell him, "You're the reason we do what we do, sir." But the moment that really got to me came when General Connor's widow, Patricia, approached Franklin Hayes as he sat alone on a bench, looking exhausted by the day's events. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, "I'm Patricia Connors. Marcus spoke about you often, especially near the end." Franklin stood immediately, the automatic respect ingrained in every Marine for the families of their fallen comrades. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband was a good man, a fine officer." "He was," she agreed, "but he never forgot what you did for him. In fact, he left something for you." She handed Franklin an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. "He wrote this letter 30 years ago and kept it in his safe, with instructions that it should be given to you if you ever came to his funeral." Franklin's hands shook as he opened the envelope and began to read. I couldn't see what it said, but I watched his face change as he read, saw surprise, then understanding, then something that looked like peace. "Ma'am," he said when he finished reading, "would you mind telling me what this means?" She smiled through her tears. "It means that Marcus never stopped looking for you. It means that every promotion he received, every medal he earned, every life he saved, he dedicated to your memory. It means that you gave him not just life, but purpose." "But I never—" "You never sought credit," she interrupted. "That's exactly what made you worth finding." Later that evening, as the crowds had gone and the ceremony equipment was being packed away, I found Franklin Hayes still sitting on that same bench, reading and rereading the letter from General Connors. I approached carefully, not wanting to intrude on a private moment. "Staff Sergeant Hayes, I'm Tank Williams, Marine Corps, Vietnam veteran. I just wanted to thank you." He looked up with those sharp blue eyes. "Thank me for what?" "For reminding all of us what service really means, for showing up today, even when they tried to turn you away, for doing what you did 54 years ago without ever asking for credit." Franklin smiled, the first time I'd seen him look genuinely happy all day. "You don't need to thank me for that, but I appreciate you saying so. Can I ask you something? How did you find out about the funeral?" "I didn't know about any of this," he said, gesturing toward the medal on his chest. "I saw on the news that General Marcus Connors had died. The name was familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. Then they showed a picture from Vietnam, and I recognized him, Lieutenant Connors, the young officer I'd helped out of a bad spot." "You didn't know he'd been looking for you?" Franklin shook his head. "I had no idea. After I got wounded and went through all those hospitals, I lost touch with most of the guys from my unit. Different war, different time. You did your job, you survived if you were lucky, and you moved on with your life. What have you been doing all these years?" "Construction work mostly. Iron work, welding, some carpentry when my back let me. Retired about 12 years ago when the injuries finally caught up with me. Never married. War kind of messed me up for relationships. No kids, just lived quietly, you know?" Something about the way he said it made me realize that Franklin Hayes had spent 54 years carrying the weight of that war alone, without recognition, without acknowledgement, without anyone understanding what he'd given or what it had cost him. "Franklin," I said, "you've got family now. Every Marine who heard your story today, every veteran who saw what happened here. You're not alone anymore." He looked down at the letter in his hands, then back at the grave where they'd just laid General Connors to rest. "You know what the hardest part was?" he said quietly. "It wasn't the lack of recognition or the lost medal. It was thinking that maybe what I did didn't matter. That maybe those 3 Marines would have found a way out on their own. That maybe I was just telling myself I'd made a difference to make myself feel better about surviving when so many good men didn't. And now? Now I know that young lieutenant became General Marcus Connors, who spent 40 years serving this country and saving other people's lives. Now I know that what I did mattered, that it had consequences I could never have imagined." He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. "Tank, can I tell you what General Connors wrote in this letter?" "If you want to." Franklin cleared his throat and began to recite from memory. "Frank, I've looked for you for 30 years, and I may never find you. But I need you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about what you did for me in that jungle. You didn't just save my life. You saved every life I've been able to touch since then. Every Marine I've led, every operation I've planned, every innovation I've contributed to military doctrine. All of it exists because you made a split-second decision to risk everything for 3 Marines you barely knew." Franklin's voice was steady, but I could see the emotion in his eyes. He wrote, "I've tried to live a life worthy of your sacrifice, but I know I can never repay the debt I owe you. The best I can do is make sure that your courage, your selflessness, your embodiment of everything Marines are supposed to be, is never forgotten. If you're reading this, it means I've finally found a way to honor you the way you deserve to be honored. Semper Fidelis, your grateful lieutenant, Marcus Connors." We sat in silence for a long moment. 2 old Marines watching the sun set over Arlington National Cemetery, thinking about brotherhood and sacrifice and the strange ways that life connects people across decades. "Franklin," I said finally, "what are you going to do now?" "I honestly don't know," he replied. "For 54 years, I've just been Frank Hayes, retired Marine, living on a pension and Social Security. Now suddenly I'm the guy who saved General Connors, and I have no idea what that means." 6 months later, I got a phone call that would answer that question in ways neither of us could have anticipated. "Tank? It's Franklin. You're not going to believe what's happened." "Tell me." "Remember General Price, the 3-star who recognized me at the funeral? He's been working on something. Turns out General Connors left more than just a letter in his will." "What kind of more?" "He set up a foundation, the Marcus Connors Foundation for Forgotten Veterans, and they want me to help run it." I nearly dropped the phone. "Franklin, that's incredible." "It gets better. The foundation is designed to help veterans who've fallen through the cracks of the system. Guys whose paperwork got lost, whose service was forgotten, whose sacrifices were never properly recognized. They want to call it the Connors-Hayes Foundation." "What would you do?" "They're offering me a position as Veterans Advocate and Program Director. Good salary, full benefits, and I get to spend my time helping other guys who've been where I've been." "Are you going to take it?" "Already said yes. At 76, I figured I was done contributing anything meaningful to the world. Turns out I was wrong." "Franklin, that's the best news I've heard in years." "There's more, Tank. General Price wants you to be involved too. He said any Marine who recognized the importance of what happened that day at Arlington should be part of making sure it doesn't happen to other veterans." "Me? What could I possibly contribute?" "Outreach. Finding the Franklin Hayes who are out there right now, standing outside gates they can't get through, carrying flowers to graves they can't reach. General Price says you've got the instincts to spot the veterans the system has forgotten." 2 years later, I was standing in the lobby of the Connors-Hayes Veterans Center in Washington, D.C., watching Franklin Hayes, now wearing a suit instead of his old uniform, but with that silver star always pinned to his lapel, address a room full of veterans, politicians, and military leaders. The center itself was impressive. A 4-story building just blocks from the Capitol, designed specifically to help veterans navigate the bureaucratic maze of benefits, health care, and services they'd earned through their service. But more than that, it was a place where forgotten warriors could find people who understood their struggles, who'd fought the same battles with the same uncaring bureaucracy. 2 years ago, Franklin said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, I stood outside a fence at Arlington National Cemetery just trying to pay my respects to a young officer I'd served with in Vietnam. I thought I was nobody special, just another old soldier with memories that nobody cared about. He paused, looking out at the crowd that included everyone from World War II veterans to young Marines just back from deployments around the world. But I learned something that day that changed my understanding of what service really means. I learned that the bonds between warriors don't fade with time. I learned that true leadership means never forgetting the people who made your success possible. Most importantly, I learned that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It evolves. Franklin looked directly at the group of elderly veterans in the front row, many of them men and women who'd been failed by the system in various ways. This center exists because one young lieutenant never forgot the day an old staff sergeant helped him when he needed it most. But it's really here because all of us, every veteran in this room, every service member who's ever worn the uniform, deserve to be remembered, to be honored, and to be helped when we need it. He held up a white flower, the same kind he'd carried to General Connor's funeral. Marcus Connors taught me that the greatest honor isn't in the medals you receive or the recognition you get, but in the lives you touch along the way. Today, we're not just opening a building. We're keeping a promise that no veteran will ever have to stand alone outside the gates again. The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most was seeing Franklin Hayes transformed from the forgotten old man at the cemetery gates into a leader, an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. In 2 years, the foundation had helped over 3,000 veterans get the benefits and recognition they'd earned, and Franklin worked 12-hour days connecting forgotten warriors with the help they needed. But the story that really captured the mission of the Connors Hayes Foundation came 6 months after the center opened. I was in Franklin's office, helping him review applications from veterans seeking assistance, when his secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Hayes, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says he doesn't have an appointment, but he heard about what you do here." "Send him in." The man who walked through the door looked like Franklin Hayes had 2 years earlier. Old uniform, proud bearing, but carrying the weight of a system that had failed him. His name was Robert Martinez, Army veteran, Vietnam, and his story was heartbreakingly familiar. "Mr. Hayes," Martinez said, "I hope you don't mind me just showing up like this. I drove down from Philadelphia because I heard about this place and I didn't know where else to turn." "What's your situation, Robert?" "I've been fighting the VA for benefits for 28 years. Got wounded in Vietnam, but my medical records were destroyed in that fire at the National Personnel Records Center in 1973. Without documentation, they keep denying my claims. I'm 73 years old, living on Social Security, can't afford the medical care I need." Franklin leaned back in his chair, and I could see the familiar fire building in his eyes. The same determination that had driven him to save 3 Marines in a Vietnamese jungle 54 years earlier. "Robert, let me ask you something. Do you have any photos from your service? Letters home? Anything that might help establish your military record?" "I've got some pictures, a few letters my mother saved, but the VA says that's not sufficient documentation." Franklin smiled. "Robert, the VA doesn't know who they're dealing with now. We've got resources they didn't have 28 years ago, and we've got something more important than that." "What's that?" "We've got time, we've got persistence, and we understand that every veteran who comes through that door represents someone who answered the call when their country needed them. We don't give up on our own." 3 months later, Robert Martinez received approval for 100% disability benefits with retroactive payments totaling over $400,000. More importantly, He became one of dozens of volunteers who helped other veterans navigate the system that had nearly broken him. "How do you do it?" I asked Franklin one day as we reviewed another stack of successful cases. "How do you keep fighting these battles day after day?" Franklin looked up from the files on his desk, and for a moment I saw not the advocate and administrator, but the young Marine who'd risked everything for 3 men he barely knew. "Tank, do you remember what you felt like the first time someone told you that your service didn't matter? That what you did in Vietnam wasn't real combat, or wasn't important, or was somehow less worthy than what other generations had done?" I nodded. Every Vietnam veteran remembered those feelings. That's what drives me. Every veteran who walks through that door has felt that same dismissal, that same sense that their sacrifice didn't count. And I know what it's like to carry that burden for 50 years. He picked up a photo from his desk, a picture of him and General Connors from Vietnam, 2 young Marines who had no idea their bond would span decades and change thousands of lives. But I also know what it feels like to finally be recognized, to finally understand that what you did mattered. Marcus Connors gave me that gift, and now I get to give it to other veterans. 3 years after the funeral at Arlington, the Connors-Hayes Foundation had helped over 5,000 veterans get the benefits and services they'd earned. Franklin Hayes, now 79, worked longer hours than men half his age, driven by a mission that went far beyond personal recognition. Last month, I accompanied Franklin to a ceremony at the Pentagon, where he was being honored for his work with forgotten veterans. As we walked through the halls lined with portraits of military leaders, Franklin stopped in front of a painting of General Marcus Connors. "You know what I think about every day?" he said, looking up at his old lieutenant's portrait. "What's that?" "How many other Franklin Hayes are out there right now? How many veterans are standing outside gates they can't get through, fighting battles nobody sees, carrying burdens nobody understands?" He turned to look at me with those sharp blue eyes that had seen so much over nearly 8 decades. "That's why this work matters, Tank. Not because of what happened to me, but because of what's happening to thousands of veterans right now who don't have anyone fighting for them." Franklin reached into his jacket and pulled out a letter, one of hundreds he'd received from veterans the foundation had helped. "Listen to this," he said, and began to read. "Mr. Hayes, I wanted you to know that because of your help, I finally received the benefits I earned 30 years ago. But more than that, you reminded me that my service mattered, that I wasn't forgotten, that someone still cared about the promises this country made to its veterans. You gave me back my dignity." Franklin folded the letter carefully and put it back in his jacket. "That's what Marcus Connors did for me at Arlington. He gave me back my dignity. Now we get to do that for other veterans every single day." As we left the Pentagon that afternoon, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. How a young Marine's split-second decision in a Vietnamese jungle had rippled forward through 54 years to create something that would help thousands of veterans for generations to come. Franklin Hayes taught me that the most important battles aren't always fought with rifles and grenades. Sometimes they're fought with persistence and compassion, with the simple refusal to let a brother or sister in arms stand alone outside the gates. He showed me that true service doesn't end with discharge papers or retirement ceremonies. Real service, the kind that defines who we are as Americans, continues every day in how we treat the people who've sacrificed for something bigger than themselves. Most importantly, Franklin Hayes proved that it's never too late for recognition, never too late for justice, never too late to honor the debts we owe to those who've served. 6 months ago, Franklin called me with news that brought everything full circle. "Tank, you remember that cemetery where this all started? Arlington? Of course. They want to bury me there when my time comes. Full military honors based on my Silver Star and my work with veterans. Can you believe that? Franklin, I can't think of anyone who deserves it more. But here's the thing that really gets me. They told me that because of the Foundation's work, they're creating a new section specifically for veterans who were forgotten by the system but later recognized for their service. They're calling it the Connors-Hayes Memorial Gardens. Franklin, that's incredible. Tank, when I stood outside those gates 3 years ago, I thought I was just paying my respects to an old comrade. I never imagined it would lead to something like this. What do you think Marcus Connors would say if he could see what you've built? Franklin was quiet for a long moment. Then, I think he'd say, mission accomplished. Franklin Hayes is 81 now, still working 12-hour days, still fighting for veterans who've been forgotten by the system. His office walls are covered with thousands of letters from veterans he's helped, photos from ceremonies and events, and in the center of it all, that picture of him and General Connors from Vietnam, 2 young Marines who had no idea their bond would change the world. Last week I asked him if he ever regretted not getting his Silver Star sooner, not getting the recognition he deserved for 54 years. Tank, he said. If I'd gotten that medal in 1969, I would have been proud for a day, maybe a week. But getting it the way I did, understanding what it meant to Marcus Connors, and what it could mean to other forgotten veterans, that's given me purpose for the rest of my life. How so? Because now I know that every veteran who walks through that door, every forgotten warrior we help, every bureaucratic battle we win, it's all connected to that day in the jungle when I decided that 3 Marines were worth risking everything for. He looked out his window toward Arlington National Cemetery, visible in the distance. The medal was never the point, Tank. The point was remembering that we take care of our own. Always have, always will. That's what being a Marine means. That's what being an American means. Franklin Hayes taught me that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names never make the history books, the ones who do what needs to be done without recognition, without fanfare, without expecting anything in return except the knowledge that they've honored their oath to something bigger than themselves. But he also taught me that America is still a country where one moment of recognition can change everything, where a general will stop a state funeral to honor a forgotten soldier, where a debt of gratitude can span 54 years and still be paid in full, where an old Marine standing outside cemetery gates can become the catalyst for helping thousands of veterans get the recognition they've earned. Most importantly, Franklin Hayes showed me that service doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. Real service, the kind that matters, the kind that defines who we are, continues every day in how we treat our fellow veterans, our communities, our country. That's what Franklin Hayes did for Marcus Connors in a Vietnamese jungle 54 years ago. That's what Marcus Connors did for Franklin Hayes at Arlington National Cemetery. And that's what both of them are still doing for veterans across America today, through the foundation that bears their names and carries forward their legacy of service. Because in America, no veteran should ever have to stand alone outside the gates. Not outside cemetery gates, not in VA waiting rooms, not in the daily struggles of life after service. We take care of our own, always have, always will. That's the lesson Franklin Hayes taught me, and that's what I'll remember until the day they plant me in Arlington myself. Hopefully in the Connors-Hayes Memorial Gardens, surrounded by other veterans who understood that true service never ends, it just finds new ways to honor the bonds that tie us together. Semper Fidelis, Franklin Hayes. Mission accomplished.